of the museum open. Behind me is Viking 1. Viking is the first spacecraft to land. Oh, I should have mentioned, I'm sorry. Spaceship One, they made its flight in 2004. And they won the X Prize. This time they got the money, but it cost them more than $10 million to build it. So that's 2004. Behind me is Viking. This is the first spacecraft to land on Mars. It did it in 1976. And one of the first things it did, because this is the first time we had landed a spacecraft on Mars, we didn't know if it was going to sink into the Martian surface. So the very first photograph from Mars was a photograph of one of the landing pads. So we knew that it wasn't sinking into the Martian surface. Then we started getting back those very famous pictures of Mars that we're used to about the red desert of Mars. Well, one of the primary missions of Viking 1 was, there were two Viking missions, Viking 1 and Viking 2, and both were trying to determine if there was life on Mars. So what they would do is, you'll see in the front there's a scoop. They would scoop up some Martian soil and dump it into this canister on top of the spaceship, kind of looks like flower petals on top. And that soil would be distributed between 3 experiments inside the spacecraft. Experiment number 1 came back, nothing. Experiment number 2 came back, nothing. For experiment number 3, they added some moisture and they added some nutrients, and the results went off the chart. And everybody said, oh my gosh, we found life on Mars. But then some other scientists said, time out, there's a chemical reason to explain those results, so you did not necessarily find life on Mars. But in the last few years, we have found something very exciting about Mars. What have we found on Mars? Water. Liquid water. And if there's liquid water on Mars, what else could there be? Life. Am I talking about whales and dolphins and mermaids? No. We're probably talking about microscopic, small, tiny things. But we now know that there's a lot of water in our solar system. This is a moon called Europa. It's one of the moons of Jupiter. And it's the moon in our solar system with the smoothest surface. It's so smooth because it's completely covered by ice. We now know that below the icy surface of Europa is an ocean of liquid water. We now know there's more water on Europa than the entire planet Earth. So this is one of the places we want to go to see if there's life someplace else in our solar system. And if we do find life way out there in outer space, maybe on this icy moon of Jupiter, what are we going to call that life form? Aliens? I was thinking Europeans. That's just me. Those brown lines are cracks in the ice of the icy surface of Europa. Up ahead, this is Mariner 2. In 1962, this became the first spacecraft to fly by another planet. It flew by Venus. Yes, sir.
How far is Europa from here, from the Earth?
How far is Europa from Earth? It's far. Let's see. Yeah, I know that's a scientific explanation. I'm sorry, but
230 or so.
well, I know Saturn is 8 AU, isn't it? So Jupiter's closer.
Yeah.
So let's ballpark. Let's say at least 6 million miles.
Hey Google, how far is Europa?
There we go. Thank you.
How far is Europa?
Or say Jupiter. We're checking Google right now.
Google Maps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyways, it flew by Venus. Didn't go into orbit, just flew by it. But this is the first spacecraft to fly by another planet, 1962. This is made from spare parts. The engineers and scientists who built Mariner 2 built this replica for us. Next to it, with the big white dish, that's Pioneer 10. Pioneer 10 is the first spacecraft designed to leave our solar system. Launched in 1972, you'll notice that Pioneer has these solar panels to generate electricity for the spacecraft from the sun. We knew that Pioneer was going so far away from the sun that solar panels wouldn't work. So if you look at 10 o'clock and at 2 o'clock, or 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock, you'll see that there's gray finned objects. Those are radioactive isotopes. It's nuclear powered. We knew it was going to be the first spacecraft to leave our solar system, so we put a message in a bottle. On the side, there's a gold plate that said, "This is who we are. This is where we live. If you find it, please return it." No, it doesn't say that. But we put a message in the bottle. Right now, Pioneer 10 is on its way towards a star called Aldebaran. Aldebaran is in a star in the galaxy of Taurus the Bull. Aldebaran, I do know, Aldebaran is 46 light years away from Earth. Light is the fastest thing in the universe. Light travels at 186,000 miles a second. So 1 light year is almost 6 trillion miles long. Trillion is a tough number for human beings to wrap their heads around. If we started counting by ones, one number every second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know how long it would take us to get to a trillion? 32,000 years. So think about that next time you think about the national debt. And I want to thank you young people for taking care of that for us. Thank you very much. They estimate that at its current speed, it's going to take 2 million years for Pioneer 10 to get to Aldebaran. So I can't wait. I'm very excited. Even though Pioneer 10 was designed to be the first spacecraft to leave the solar system, it was not the first spacecraft to leave the solar system. What was the first spacecraft that left our solar system? Voyager. Voyager launched in 1977, was traveling faster, and in 2012, it left our solar system. So that was the first. Voyager 2 was second. Pioneer 10 will be number 3. By the way, there were 2 Pioneers, Pioneer 10 and then Pioneer 11. NASA had planned to launch a third called Pioneer 12, but the funding got cut. Ladies and gentlemen, that's Pioneer 12. That's a real spacecraft. It's just that it wasn't launched. All right, so we were talking about Voyager. In Voyager, instead of a gold plate, they made a gold record that contained photographs from Earth, sounds from Earth, music from Earth, greetings in every language on Earth, to tell people, anybody who found it, that this is who we are. All right, who was the first country to launch an artificial satellite? Russia. What was it? Sputnik. Here we go, Sputnik, right here. In October of 1957, the Russians launched the first artificial satellite. And it orbited the Earth. You see these long antennae? It had a radio transmitter inside. And as it orbited the Earth, it would beep. It would go beep, 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 beep as it orbited the Earth. They made it very shiny because the sun would reflect off Sputnik, and people all over the world could see it flying over. And the newspapers at the time would put out schedules of when to go out in your front yard and look for Sputnik. It only stayed up there for 90 days before it re-entered the atmosphere and burned up. That was October of 1957. Then in January of 1958, the United States launched their very first satellite. It was called Explorer 1. Kind of looks like a pencil. This is the first satellite to do science in outer space. There was a professor at the University of Iowa by the name of James Van Allen, and he predicted that surrounding the Earth were radioactive belts. So on board Explorer 1, they put a Geiger counter. And when it got into space, sure enough, the Geiger counter went out, proving Professor Van Allen was correct. Today we call them the Van Allen belts that surround our Earth. Explorer 1, like Sputnik 1, re-entered the Earth's atmosphere and burned up. That is, in case something happened to Explorer 1, that maybe it blew up on launch, this would have been number 2. So again, that's a real satellite, it's just that it wasn't launched. Who was the first country to put something alive in outer space? Russia. What was it? A dog. It was a dog named Laika. Laika was a stray dog they found on the street. They picked it up, put it in a rocket, and blasted it off into space. Unfortunately, they did not make plans to bring Laika back. So they put something in its food so that it would fall asleep and not wake up. Kind of sad. Who was the first country to put something alive in space that came back alive?
Russia.
The United States. And what was it? A monkey named Abel. Here's Abel. And it was launched and it went up to outer space and it came back alive for a while. You see, they had put electrodes on its head to measure its bioactivity. And when it landed, they took it into the operating room to take out the electrodes. Abel had a bad reaction to the anesthesia and died. But don't worry, we had it stuffed. And until the renovation started, you could see Abel stuffed here in our museum. So, kind of a claim to fame. Who was the first human being to go up in outer space? Yuri Gagarin from the Soviet Union. April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first person to go up into outer space. He made one orbit of the Earth and he landed. 3 weeks later, in May of 1961, the first American, well, I should say, Yuri was launched by a Soviet R-7, which was an intercontinental ballistic missile. 3 weeks later, the first American went into outer space, and he was Alan Shepard. Alan Shepard was the first American to go into space 3 weeks after Yuri Gagarin. He was launched by a Redstone intermediate nuclear range missile. So he did not have enough energy to get into orbit. Like Spaceship One, Alan Shepard went up into space and came right back down. 15-minute flight total. After that 15-minute flight, President Kennedy announced to the world that he was committing our nation, before the decade was out, of sending a man to the moon and bringing him back safely. NASA said, this is pretty good. We got 15 minutes of flight time and now we're going to the moon. But when the boss says you're going to do it, you're going to do it. Who was the first American to orbit the Earth? Come on, guys. John Glenn. John Glenn was the first American to orbit the Earth, and he did it in this Mercury capsule right here. This is Friendship 7. This is the spaceship that took the first American to orbit the Earth. Where was John Glenn from? John Glenn was launched by an Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile, so that had more power to put him in the orbit. John Glenn would later go on to be a senator from the great state of Ohio. The answer was Ohio, folks. John Glenn would later become a senator. John Glenn would later become the oldest person to fly in space at the age of 77. He went back into space aboard the Space Shuttle Discovery, which you can see at our Udvar Hazy Center out by Dulles Airport. So there were 6 Mercury missions where one person went up into space. But to get to the moon, NASA knew they had to accomplish 3 tasks. They had to be able to rendezvous and dock in space. They knew that they had to be able to live outside of the spaceship. They didn't just want to go to the moon and look around and then come back. They wanted to get out on the moon. And 3, they had to be able to stay in space for a long time. So to check all those things out to see if people could do it, we did Gemini. This is a Gemini 4. This is where 2 people went into space. Gemini was launched by a Titan intercontinental ballistic missile. So this is what Gemini looked like in space. The white part in the back is the service module. That's where they carried fuel and oxygen. They were able to rendezvous with other spacecraft up in outer space. They were able to dock with unmanned space vehicles called the Gina rockets, who conducted the very first successful docking. A gentleman by the name of Neil Armstrong. We'll talk about him in a little bit. And in this spacecraft right here, Gemini 4, the first American to walk in space, Ed White. He left the spaceship and he walked around in space. So we knew that people could live outside of space. The third requirement, could people stay in space for a long time, was accomplished by this crew. That's Jim Lovell and Frank Borman. In a Gemini spacecraft that size, they spent 14 days in space. 14 days in a space that big. On day number 2, Frank Borman lost his toothbrush. So they had to share the same toothbrush. They knew being an astronaut was dangerous, so they knew the risks. So up until this time, Both the United States and the Soviet Union are using military rockets to get astronauts and cosmonauts into space. But to go to the moon would take a rocket bigger than anything in anybody's arsenal. So let's walk over this way and let's talk about going to the moon.